Hey students, welcome to a note video. Today we're going to be talking about a new national identity, which is going to cover some important things happening in the early 1800s during United States history. So when we last left off, just jumping right in, remember to follow along with your notes. When we last left off, we were talking about Thomas Jefferson's presidency, right, and all the things that happened during his presidency. For example, the Lewis and Clark expedition, and then we also got past Jefferson and we talked about the War of 1812, and that's kind of where we last left off. So jumping back in from there, after the War of 1812 ends, the U.S. and Great Britain actually still have some issues that they have to work out. A lot of them are revolved around the Great Lakes, because the Great Lakes share a border with the United States and Canada, which remember is a colony of Great Britain. Both the U.S. and Great Britain wanted navies and fishing rights on the Great Lakes. And instead of going to war again over this, they reached an agreement. It's called the Rush-Bagot Agreement, and it limited naval power on the Great Lakes for both the U.S. and British Canada, but just said, you know, it's just for us to, we'll share it, we'll get along fine. So that's good. Another thing that's going to happen shortly after the War of 1812 is called the Convention of 1818. It's another treaty between the U.S. and Great Britain, and this one is going to set the border between the U.S. and Canada at 49 degrees north latitude as far as the Rocky Mountains. But once you get to the Rocky Mountains, that whole Pacific Northwest territory, we just agree that we're going to share it together. And that land is actually very valuable because there's a lot of animals that produce fur that people want to wear into coats and hats and things like that. So that Pacific Northwest area is very valuable, but we agreed to share it. So overall, some pretty solid, good agreements happening between the U.S. and Great Britain after now we've had our second American Revolution with the War of 1812. Additionally, we have some disputes happening in Florida. So President Monroe, who was our president at this time, so if you think back, right, we had Washington, we had Adams, we had Jefferson, then we had James Madison, right, our president during the War of 1812, and now we're on to our next president, James Monroe. So James Monroe sent some troops down to Florida. These troops were led by someone you guys will recognize, Andrew Jackson, and they were just supposed to go down there and sort of figure out what the issue is, because there were some Native Americans that were, fighting some of the American settlers and saying, hey, this is our land. So troops are sent down to the Florida area. These Native Americans that had settled in this land were called the Seminoles, and one of the reasons the U.S. had a lot of conflict with them is because they were actually helping slaves from the South run away and get to freedom. So, really great on their part, but obviously a lot of American Southerners did not like them, and that's one of the big reasons why there's this big dispute and why there's going to be fighting. So Jackson, actually, when he goes down to Florida, him and his troops invade Florida and start a war called the First Seminole War. Jackson overthrew the Florida governor and attacked military posts without orders from the president. So, not exactly following orders, but ultimately, again, it's going to lead to another treaty, but this one is going to be with Spain, right, because Florida still belonged to Spain at this point. So it's called the Adams-Onis Treaty, and it settled all border disputes between the U.S. and Spain. So what happened with this treaty is we said, okay, we get Florida, but, we have some settlers going into Texas area. We will make sure that they don't go there, and we'll give up any claim to any land that we have there. You guys can guess how long that's going to last if you know anything about American history. Just wait till a couple weeks from now, and you'll see how well that goes. But regardless, now the United States has gained Florida as well. So this map is just showing you the agreements. So this little lined area, right, is the land that was ceded from Spain to the United States. Here is our border, right, with Spain. This land is still Spain, right? This is the land we're sharing with British Canada, and this is our land, still trying to figure out how to break up all this land. So, diving in from there, by the 1820s, many of the Spanish colonies in North and South America had actually started to declare independence from their, the people that had colonized them, right? Which is Spain. One of the most famous revolutionary fighters was Simón Bolívar, and he led many of these revolutions throughout North and South America. But Americans actually really supported these revolutions because it kind of reminded us of our revolution, right? We threw off our people who had suppressed us for a good amount of time, right? Our colonizers, even though we actually came from there, but we won't get into that. But regardless, we were inspired by them and supported many of these revolutions. So this map is showing you year 1800, showing you all of these. All the green is Spanish colonies, the red is British, purple is Dutch, yellow is Portuguese, orange is French. But then 30 years later, all the purple are independent countries. So like I said, you could see how many revolutions were happening. You could just take an entire class about this, learning about Latin American revolutions. It's really interesting. So continuing on, so all these revolutions are happening. President Monroe is worried, especially after Mexico gains their independence. He's worried that Europeans are still going to try and interfere and might mess with these countries that have just gained their independence. And he wanted them to respect this new independence that many of these countries had gained. So John Quincy Adams and James Monroe, John Quincy Adams, the son of John Adams, and James Monroe are going to draft a document called the Monroe Doctrine, and it's going to talk about American policy and warning Europeans not to interfere in the Americas. So there's four main points. One, this is exactly what it said. So it said, one, the U.S. would not interfere in affairs of European nations, so we will leave you alone. Two, U.S. will not interfere with European colonies, so any colonies that you still have, we're going to leave them alone. Three, the Western Hemisphere is off limits to future colonization by any foreign power. Western Hemisphere is referring to North and South America. And four, the U.S. would consider any attempt to colonize a hostile act, which could lead to war, right? So that's going on, right? We've got all these revolutions happening. We got a lot of different agreements and treaties happening with different nations. But really what you're seeing in the United States is a growing rise in nationalism, which means feelings of pride and loyalty to a nation. We talked a little bit about this when we talked about the War of 1812 and when it ended, that Americans were just refreshed and renewed and were we're America, we can do this. And people were just really patriotic and inspired by their country. And so Henry Clay actually is, again, a strong supporter of this growing nationalism, and he's a U.S. representative, and he develops a system called the American system. And he says we need to make our economy self-sufficient, we need to improve roads, we need to make some canals, we need to unite our country, and just go from there. And so what you have to think about is most of the roads at this time in the United States were made of dirt, so traveling between states is very difficult. So these are all really great ideas to try and unite our nation more. And he also supported the National Bank, and he wanted to use that tax money to improve the roads and canals to improve and unite the country. So one part of the national system is the development of this thing called the Cumberland Road, and it's the first road built by the federal government. It ran from Maryland to the Ohio River in West Virginia, and it was all done by hand with small tools. Remember, there's no construction cranes that exist at this time, so it's a lot of work. They had to cut through thick forests. You can see the people down in the picture. That's literally how they made this road. So it kind of makes you appreciate, I guess, what we have now for sure. But it's going to allow transportation of people and goods much quicker. And the Cumberland Road eventually is going to join another road, and it'll be known as the National Road. But you can see it's eventually going to go across several different states here. So very important. Additionally, we're going to see the creation of the Erie Canal, because water transportation, we've talked about this already, is the fastest way to move goods, like large amounts of goods, because there's no trains, right? There's no like cars, so it's, going by horseback takes a while. So moving large amounts of goods, water is the best way to do that. So there was proposal that we should connect like Lake Erie, which you can kind of see over here in this map, and connect it and make it closer to New York City, like closer to a river, so it's easier to trade down to New York City. And so this canal is going to be built, and it was actually dug by hand. A canal is like a waterway, so you're like digging out dirt so that water can flow through there. And it was dug mostly by German and Irish immigrants, by hand again. But when it's finished, it's going to just allow for the movement of goods much more quickly, and it's going to make New York City even more important. And it's still there today, so pretty cool. But really what to know, like this era, this from 1815 to 1825, is known as the era of good feelings. It's a time, right, where we're like focused on creating things, uniting our nation, and just like improving America. There's obviously, it's not going to be perfect. We'll get to some conflict in just a minute. Don't worry. And oh, here's a great, this is a great picture showing like what a canal is, right? It's a waterway. So there you go. So I told you we get to some conflict, and here we go. There are still disagreements between the states in the U.S., and it becomes known as sectionalism, right? That people argue like that you're from a certain section of the United States, and that maybe Congress is favoring your section, and so it's called like sectionalism. I know, what a name, but that's what it's known as. And so here is the issue that comes up. In 1819, the state of Missouri, or not the state of Missouri, Missouri, the territory, applies to become a state. And remember, we've talked about this. You have to have a certain number of people living there. You have to make a constitution, and you have to apply to be a state. So they're applying to be a state, but here's the issue. At that time, in like the United States, we had 11 free states and 11 slave states. So if we added this new one, it would tip the balance in the Senate. Congress would not have an even balance of slave state representatives and free state representatives. And people were not happy about this, obviously, at all. That's a big deal because they could be passing more laws supporting slavery, and people might not be happy about that. So Congress first tries to pass an amendment saying that Missouri could enter as a slave state, but that they could not import slaves from Africa, and any children of slaves would be free. Sounds like a better idea than just letting slavery continue forever, but Southerners did not like this, and they did not allow it to pass. So Henry Clay, which he's already come up once and he's coming up again, he's known as the Great Compromiser. He gets a lot of compromises created. He proposes the Missouri Compromise, which says Missouri would enter as a slave state and Maine would join as a free state. So therefore, the states would be kept equal. We'd still have a number of equal and slave states. Slavery would be prohibited in any new territories or states formed north of 3630 latitude, Missouri, which was Missouri's southern border. Congress did pass this and agree to it. Oh, and here's a little video. I have it in your notes, so you'll have to check that out when you get a chance. But here's what we're talking about. So they said Missouri will be allowed to be a slave state, but any states added after this, below this line, will be slave. Anything above it will be free. So do you see that there's probably going to be some conflict as more states are added? There's definitely going to be more conflict. Just wait. Missouri Compromise is going to be thrown out the window pretty soon. But for now, this is how we're dealing with slavery and new states. So luckily we can take a break from the drama and also talk about some culture in the United States. So we don't really get to talk about this a lot, but let's talk about some authors and things like that. So one famous author, an American writer, was named Washington Irving. He was named after George Washington, and he liked to write humor or satire, usually about American history. He liked to warn Americans, like through his writing, that we should learn from the past and be very cautious about the future. His famous short story he wrote was called Rip Van Winkle, and it's about a man who falls asleep during the American Revolution and wakes up 20 years later in a society that he doesn't recognize. And he also wrote, Washington Irving also wrote The Legend of Sleepy Hollow, which we will read part of that in class coming up. Another well-known writer during this time period was James Fenimore Cooper. He wrote about the West, and especially about Native Americans. And he wrote a famous novel called The Last of the Mohicans, which was made into a movie, if you've ever seen it. But he made this genre popular called historical fiction. So you're writing about history, like a real event, but usually you're making up a story that's not true. He made that genre very popular with some of his novels. And we're going to read part of The Last of the Mohicans as well in class. Additionally, as far as paintings go, Thomas Cole was a famous landscape painter. He wanted to show the beauty of nature. We were starting to go away from just focusing on portraits of people and more about nature. He founded the Hudson River School, which created paintings, like I said, that reflected nature, pride in our nation, appreciation of what we have, and he encouraged American artists to paint landscapes. And then lastly, what we're going to talk about is architecture in the United States. Originally, we were trying to copy Europe, but President Jefferson advised that we should really be more influenced by the Greeks and the Romans, since that's where democracy started. And so you're going to see a lot more use of marble, stone, columns in the types of buildings that are being built. This is a perfect example right up here. This is the Supreme Court building up at the top. It looks very much like Roman Greek architecture. Additionally, you're going to see some changes in education. More will come, but not for a good chunk of time. But for now, we're getting a little bit of change in education. In 1837, Massachusetts created the State Board of Education, and they're the first state to provide a state-governed education and create public schools, and they're going to continue to grow and thrive. So great job, Massachusetts, and many states will follow after them with creating federalized education and offer more public school for people. So that's it for these notes. They were short and sweet. Thanks for following along. And